Don't you dare leave yet. I need you to sign the house first." Those were the exact words my husband spoke to me while I was lying in a medical bed, connected to monitors, too weak to even sit up on my own. He didn't hold my hand. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He placed a clipboard on my lap and pointed at a line with his index finger, as if I were his employee, as if my life were nothing more than a delay in his paperwork. My name is Laura Mitchell. I am 37 years old, and for the last 9 years, I have been the one person in this marriage that everyone leans on, but no one truly sees. I am the one who pays the bills on time, the one who remembers every appointment, every deadline, every number that keeps this household running. I am the invisible thread, the safety net that holds everything together. And the moment I became weak, the moment I was no longer useful, is the exact moment my husband showed me exactly what I had always been to him. Before we begin the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. We post new stories every day. The room was cold. That is the first thing I remember with clarity. Not the sound of the machines humming beside me. Not the pale fluorescent lights above my head. The cold. It came through the thin blanket they had given me, through the hospital gown that barely covered my arms, and it settled somewhere deep inside my chest, in a place that had nothing to do with temperature. I had been admitted 3 days earlier. A serious infection had taken hold inside my body in a way that no one had predicted. The doctors spoke in careful, measured tones. They used words like aggressive and critical window. They told Richard, my husband, that I needed rest, real rest, the kind that meant no visitors during certain hours, no phone calls, no stress of any kind. But Richard does not follow rules he finds inconvenient. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because Tuesdays were always the days I used to handle the household finances. Every Tuesday morning, before the sun was fully up, I would sit at the kitchen table in our Charlotte home with a cup of coffee and a leather-bound notebook, and I would go through every single account, every credit card, every insurance payment, every mortgage line. It was a system I had built from scratch 9 years ago, when Richard and I first moved into that house together, and it had never failed. Not once. That Tuesday, I could not sit at any table. I could not hold a pen. My hands were shaking so badly that even gripping the edge of the blanket felt like an effort. The nurses had adjusted my medication twice that morning, and I was drifting in and out of a heavy, dreamless sleep. The monitors beside me beeped in a slow, steady rhythm, a sound that had become almost hypnotic over the past 72 hours. Every now and then, a nurse would come in, check a reading on one of the screens, write something down on a clipboard of their own, and leave without a word. The room had become a kind of waiting room inside a waiting room. I was waiting for my body to get better, and somewhere beyond these walls, I knew Richard was waiting for something else entirely. Then the door opened. I did not need to look up to know it was him. Richard has a specific way of entering a room. He does not knock. He does not pause at the threshold to gauge whether his presence is welcome. He simply walks in, and the space around him reorganizes itself to accommodate him. That is something I learned about him very early on. It was one of the things I once found attractive about him. Confidence, I called it then. Now I have a different word for it. He was wearing a dark navy suit, the same one he wore to business meetings downtown. His shoes were polished. His hair was combed back in that deliberate way he always arranged it, before stepping into a room where he needed to look like someone worth listening to. He carried a manila folder in one hand and a clipboard in the other. He looked, in every way, like a man who had come to conduct business, because that is exactly what he had come to do. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not sit down in the chair beside my bed, the chair that had been empty for 3 days, the one the nurses sometimes used to place extra towels or a fresh set of linens. Instead, he pulled the small rolling table closer to me, the one that had been holding my water cup and a small tray of untouched food, and he placed the clipboard directly on top of it. Then he clicked a pen and set it down next to the papers. I looked at the documents. They were printed on clean, white paper. The font was small, but clear. At the top of the first page, I could see the words, "Deed transfer, residential property." Below that was our address, The address of the house where we had lived together for 9 years. The house where I had planted the garden in the backyard every spring. The house where I had painted the kitchen walls that particular shade of warm yellow that Richard had chosen, but never once helped me apply. The house where I had folded laundry and cooked dinners and sat alone on weekend mornings reading the news while he slept in, never once thinking about how many hours of invisible work kept that house standing. I looked back up at him. "What is this?" I asked. My voice came out quieter than I intended, thinner. It sounded like someone else's voice. Richard glanced at the clipboard, then back at me, as though I had asked a question that did not deserve a serious answer. "It is what it looks like," he said. "I need you to sign the house over to me before anything else happens. Before anything else happens." That was his way of saying it. Not in case something goes wrong. Not just to be safe. He said it the way someone might say, before the store closes, or before the flight leaves, as if my being in that bed were a logistical inconvenience, a scheduling conflict. I did not respond immediately. I stared at the documents for a long time. Long enough for the machine beside me to beep twice. Long enough for the fluorescent light above us to flicker once, the way it always did in that particular room. Then Richard leaned forward slightly. He folded his arms across his chest. I noticed his jaw was set tight, the way it always was when he was preparing to say something he had already decided was final. "Laura," he said, and the way he said my name was not the way a husband says his wife's name when she is sick. It was the way a manager says a subordinate's name when a deadline is approaching. It was firm. It was impatient. "I am not going to stand here and argue about this," he continued. "The lawyers have already reviewed everything. All I need is your signature. That is it. One signature, and we can move forward. It should take you 30 seconds. 30 seconds. He had timed it in his head. He had already calculated how long it would take me to do the one thing he needed from me, and he had factored it into his afternoon like an item on a to-do list. Move forward, as if I were the one holding something up, as if the only thing standing between him and whatever he wanted was a line on a piece of paper and the hand that was too weak to hold a pen without trembling. Something shifted inside me in that moment. It was not anger. Not exactly. Anger is loud. It is hot. It demands to be heard. What I felt was quieter than that. It was a kind of clarity, a sharp, sudden awareness, like a lens finally coming into focus after years of blur. I had spent 9 years being the person who made everything work. I had been the one to handle every document, every contract, every financial detail in this household. I had done it silently, completely, and without ever once being thanked for it. And now, in the one moment when I was at my most vulnerable, the person I had built that entire system for was standing at my bedside asking me to hand him the keys to everything, not because he was worried about me, but because he was worried about himself. I looked at him for a long moment. I did not blink. I did not look away. Then I turned my face toward the window. I said nothing. Richard waited. 5 seconds passed, then 10. I could feel his eyes on me, studying my expression, trying to read something in the way I had turned away from him. But I gave him nothing. Not a word. Not a reaction. Not even the small crease of a frown across my forehead. I simply looked out at the gray Charlotte sky and let the silence sit between us like a wall made of stone. He clicked the pen once more. Then he set it down harder this time, as if placing it firmly on the clipboard were a statement in itself. "Fine," he said. "Think about it. But Laura, do not take too long. This is time-sensitive." He left the room the same way he had entered it, without knocking, without pausing. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room felt larger all at once, the way a space always does when someone like Richard leaves it. I stayed in that position for several minutes, looking out. The window. The sky was overcast. A thin layer of cloud sat low over the city, the kind that makes everything look muted, as though someone had turned down the brightness on the entire world. Somewhere far below, I could see the tops of buildings along the street, and beyond them, the faint outline of the skyline stretching toward the horizon. Charlotte in February, gray and quiet and still. And then, very slowly, I turned my head, back toward the clipboard. I looked at the documents again. I read every line, every clause, every number. Even though my vision was blurry and my hands were shaking, I read every single word with the same precision I had used every Tuesday morning at that kitchen table for 9 years. I read the name of the property, the assessed value, the legal language that would, if signed, remove my name from the deed entirely and transfer full ownership to Richard, alone, with no conditions and no protections. Because here is the thing Richard did not know, the thing no one in that room knew, except me. I had not spent the last several weeks being helpless. I had spent the last several weeks preparing, before the infection took hold, before I was admitted, before I was placed in this bed with these machines and this cold blanket and these flickering lights. I had been working quietly, methodically, in the same way I had always worked, alone, without drawing attention, without telling anyone what I was doing or why. I had contacted a lawyer, a real one, not the one Richard used, not the firm he trusted, not anyone connected to him in any way. I had found someone independent, someone who specialized in exactly this kind of situation. And over the course of 2 weeks, I had signed and filed and organized a set of documents that gave me something Richard had never once considered I might have: full legal authority over every asset, every account, every piece of property in our shared name, power of attorney, filed, notarized, complete. Richard did not know. He had no idea, because I had done it all before I got sick, before he had any reason to think I was planning anything, before the infection, before the doctors, before this bed. I had done it the way I had always done everything in this marriage, invisibly, thoroughly, and without a single word to him about it. I looked at his clipboard one more time, at his deed transfer form, at the line where he wanted my signature, and I did not pick up the pen. I pressed the call button on the side of my bed instead. A nurse arrived within minutes. I asked her, politely, to remove the clipboard from my table. She did so without comment, placing it on the floor near the door where it would be out of my sight. I did not look at it again. 3 days later, I was discharged. The doctors told me I was stable. The infection had been brought under control. I could go home, but I would need to rest and follow up with my care team within the week. I left the medical center on a Thursday morning. I walked out through the main entrance on my own 2 feet, though slowly, leaning slightly on a cane the staff had provided. I did not call Richard to tell him I was being released. I did not text him. I did not ask him to pick me up. I called a car instead, a quiet, unremarkable sedan, driven by a service I had used before. The driver did not speak, which was exactly what I needed. I sat in the back seat, wrapped in a beige cardigan that was 2 sizes too large for me, and I watched. Charlotte passed by outside the window. The buildings, the streets, the gray sky that had begun, just barely, to let a little light through. I did not go home. I went somewhere else entirely. And that is where the story truly begins. People always say that the beginning of a marriage is the easiest part, that the hardest things come later, slowly, like cracks in a foundation that no one notices until the whole structure starts to lean. They are wrong. Or at least, they were wrong about mine. The hardest part of my marriage to Richard started on the very first day. I just did not have the language to recognize it yet. We met in the spring of 2014. I was 28 years old. I was working as a bookkeeper for a mid-sized accounting firm in uptown Charlotte. It was not glamorous work, but I was good at it. Quietly, steadily good at it. I was the kind of person who noticed when a column of numbers did not add up, when a date was off by 1 day, when a file was missing from a folder that should have contained 12. I was the kind of person that no one thanked but everyone depended on. Richard walked into my life the way he walks into every room, without warning, without hesitation. He was visiting the firm for a meeting with one of the senior partners, and somehow, by the end of that afternoon, he had found his way to my desk. He was charming. I want to be honest about that. He was genuinely, effortlessly charming. He asked me what I was working on. He leaned against the edge of my desk with his arms crossed and listened as if my answer mattered. He laughed at something I said, and it was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere in the chest. He told me his name was Richard. He told me he was in real estate. He told, me he liked the way I organized my files. It was that last thing that caught my attention. Not the smile, not the confidence. The fact that he noticed the files. We had coffee the next day, then dinner 2 days after that. Within 3 weeks, we were seeing each other regularly. Within 3 months, he had moved into my apartment. Within 6 months, we were engaged. Within a year, we were married and living in a house in a quiet neighborhood near the southern edge of Charlotte, a place with a wide front porch and a backyard that caught the morning light in a way that made me fall in love with it the moment I saw it. I remember the day we signed the papers for that house. I was the one who had reviewed every document, every clause, every condition of the mortgage. I had sat at the kitchen table the night before with a highlighter and gone through all of it, page by page, the way I did with every financial document that crossed my path. Richard had kissed the top of my head and told me he did not know what he would do without me. I believed him. For a while, I believed every word he said. The first year of our marriage was, by most measures, a good one. We built a routine together. I continued working at the firm. Richard managed his real estate investments, which were modest at first but grew steadily over time. I handled the household finances, the taxes, the insurance, the mortgage payments, the utility bills, the car maintenance schedules, all of it. I did not complain about this arrangement. It felt natural to me. I had always been the one who kept things in order. It was not something I resented. It was simply what I did. Richard, for his part, handled the social side of things. He was the one who called friends for dinner. He was the one who remembered birthdays, who organized gatherings, who made sure we were connected to the right people in the right circles. He was good at that, better than I ever could have been. Where I was quiet and precise, he was loud and magnetic. We balanced each other out. That is what I told myself, anyway. The first crack appeared about 18 months into the marriage. It was a small thing, so small that I almost did not notice it at the time. Almost. We had gone out to dinner with 2 other couples, friends of Richard from his early days in real estate. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place where the menu did not have prices printed on it. Richard had chosen it. He always chose the restaurants. At some point during the evening, the conversation turned to finances. One of the other wives, a woman named Carol, mentioned that she and her husband had just refinanced their home. She said it casually, the way people talk about such things at dinner parties. Richard, without missing a beat, turned to me and spoke in that easy way of his. He told everyone at the table that Laura was the one who handled all of it, that he had no idea what was going on with their accounts, that she was the brains behind the operation. He said it with a smile. He said it in a way that sounded like a compliment, and everyone at the table laughed, and Carol raised her glass in a small toast to me, and I smiled back. But something about the way Richard said it stayed with me long after we left the restaurant. Not the words themselves, the tone. There was something underneath it, something that sounded less like admiration and more like a careful, deliberate act of distancing himself from the numbers, as if he were drawing a line, right there in front of everyone, that said, I am not the one who deals with the money. She is. If anything ever goes wrong, it is her department. I did not think about it much at the time. I told myself I was reading too much into it, but I remembered it. I kept it stored away in the back of my mind, in the same place where I kept all the small details that did not fit neatly into the larger picture of my life. The second crack appeared about a year after that, and this one was louder. Richard had started spending more time away from home, not in a way that raised obvious alarms. He was never gone for days at a time. He never came home acting guilty or evasive. He was simply absent, present in the house but not really there. He would sit on the couch in the evenings, scrolling through his phone while I cooked dinner. He would eat without commenting on the food. He would go to bed without saying goodnight. I tried to bring it up one evening. We were sitting in the living room after dinner. The television was on, but neither of us was watching it. I turned to him and said that I had noticed he seemed distant lately, that I wanted to know if everything was okay between us. Richard looked at me. He did not look away. He did not look guilty. He looked, if anything, slightly annoyed, as though I had interrupted something more important. Everything is fine, Laura, he said. I have been busy with work. You know how it is. I did know how it was, or at least, I thought I did. Real estate was unpredictable. Deals fell through. Timelines shifted. I had seen it with my own eyes, watching the numbers in our accounts fluctuate from month to month depending on what projects Richard had closed and which ones were still pending. So I let it go. I did not push. I did not ask again. That was my mistake. Not the only one, but one of the biggest. Over the next 2 years, the pattern continued. Richard pulled further and further back, not in any dramatic way, but in the slow, steady manner of a tide going out. The conversations between us grew shorter. The evenings we spent together grew quieter. He began making decisions about the house, about our shared finances, about our social plans, without consulting me first. Small decisions at first, then larger ones. He opened a second investment account in his name only. He told me it was for a new project, something he did not want to complicate with joint paperwork. I did not question it. I should have, but by that point, questioning Richard had become something that felt uneasy in a way I could not fully explain. It was not the kind of unease that comes from fear. It was something quieter than that. The slow, uncomfortable awareness that the person you share a life with does not want your input, does not want your questions, does not want you involved in the parts of his life that carry weight. I became, without ever meaning to, the person who managed the background. The bills, the schedules, the receipts, the taxes, all the machinery that kept the household running, but none of the decisions that shaped where it was going. And I did it quietly, because that is what Laura Mitchell does. That is what I have always done. I hold things together without being seen. I keep the system running without drawing attention to myself. I am the thread that no one pulls on, because they do not even know it is there. The third crack, the one that changed everything, appeared about 6 months before I was admitted to the medical center. And this one was not a crack at all. It was a door. It opened on an ordinary Wednesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, as I always did, going through the household accounts. The coffee was hot. The notebook was open. The numbers were laid out in front of me in neat rows, the way they always were. But something was off. I noticed it the way I always noticed things, not with a sudden jolt of realization, but with a quiet, careful awareness. A line item that did not match. A transfer that had been made from our joint checking account to an account I did not recognize. It was not a large amount. It was not so large that it would have raised a flag in any automated system, but it was there, and it was not something I had authorized. I spent the next 2 hours tracing it. I pulled up statements. I cross-referenced dates. I compared the transfer patterns with every other transaction in our shared accounts over the past 12 months, and what I found made the coffee go cold in my hands. It was not one transfer. It was dozens. Small amounts, spread across different dates, moved quietly from our joint accounts into accounts registered entirely in Richard's name. Accounts I had never seen before. Accounts that had been open, based on the paperwork trail, for over a year. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after I finished. The morning light had shifted across the floor. The coffee was completely cold. The notebook was still open in front of me, but I was no longer looking at the numbers. I was looking at the surface of the table, at the small scratch near the edge where a moving box had scraped it on the day we first moved in, years ago. A small mark that I had never bothered to fix because it was part of the house now, part of our story, or what I had believed our story to be. I did not cry. I did not call Richard. I did not do anything rash or impulsive or loud. I closed the notebook. I finished my coffee, cold as it was, and I sat with the weight of what I had learned, quietly, the way I sit with all the things in my life that no one else sees. That evening, after Richard had left, for another one of his meetings, I made a single phone call. I called a lawyer, not one that Richard knew, not one connected to any firm or person in his network. I found her through a careful, private search. Her name was Margaret Chen. She was based in Raleigh, far enough from Charlotte that there was no risk of Richard crossing paths with her. She specialized in cases exactly like mine. I told her everything, every number, every transfer, every account. I told her about the house, about the way Richard had been pulling assets into his name, slowly and quietly, over the course of more than a year. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she spoke. She told me that I was not in a bad position, that I was, in fact, in a very good one, but only if we acted carefully, and only if we acted now. We acted over the next 2 weeks. Margaret and I built a structure of documents so thorough, so precise, that it would have taken Richard's own lawyers months to untangle it. Power of attorney, asset freezing orders, notarized statements, a complete record of every unauthorized transfer, time-stamped and verified, every account, every move he had made, all of it documented, all of it sealed, all of it ready. I did all of this while continuing to live in that house, while continuing to cook dinners that Richard ate without comment, while continuing to sit at the kitchen table every Tuesday morning with my notebook and my coffee, going through the numbers the way I always had. He never suspected a thing. He had no reason to. In his mind, I was exactly what I had always been, the quiet one, the one who handled the paperwork, the one who kept everything running in the background. While he moved through the world, I did it the way I had done everything in that marriage, quietly, completely, and without a single word to the man who thought he knew exactly how much power I had. He had no idea, not one single idea. And then the infection came, and everything changed. But not in the way Richard expected, not in the way he expected at all. Let's take a short pause in the story to ask you, are you enjoying this story? So far, if you are, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post new stories every day. Thank you. Now, let's continue. The place I went was not far from Charlotte, a small inn on the outskirts of a town called Gastonia, about 30 minutes west of the city. I had driven past it dozens of times before without ever paying it any attention. It was the kind of place that blends into the landscape. No signs that glow at night. No flashy neon. Just a quiet, single-story building with wooden shutters and a gravel parking lot that was mostly empty on weekday mornings. That is exactly why I chose it. I checked in under my own name. There was no reason to hide. Richard did not know this place existed. He had never driven through Gastonia for any purpose other than passing through it on the way somewhere else. And even if, by some chance, he had seen the name on a credit card statement, it would have meant nothing to him. Just another line item in a life he had stopped paying attention to a long time ago. The room was small, a single bed with a white duvet, a wooden nightstand with a lamp that cast a warm, amber glow, a window that looked out onto a stretch of bare winter trees, their branches thin and dark against a pale gray sky. There was a small bathroom with white tiles and a towel rack that held exactly 2 towels. Nothing more, nothing less. It was, in its own quiet way, perfect. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after I closed the door behind me. I did not unpack. I did not turn on the television. I did not even take off my shoes. I simply sat there in the stillness of that small room and let the silence settle around me like dust after a storm has passed. For the first time in weeks, no one was watching me. No nurses checking monitors. No doctors writing notes on clipboards. No Richard standing at the foot of my bed with a pen and a folder, and that particular look on his face. The one that said I was a task to be completed, not a person to be loved. For the first time in a very long time, I was completely, entirely alone. And for the first time in a very long time, being alone felt less like emptiness and more like space, room to breathe, room to think, room to finally, carefully, look at the full shape of what my life had become. I pressed my palms flat against the mattress on either side of me and felt the cool, firm surface beneath my fingers. The sheets smelled faintly of soap, clean and neutral and entirely uncomplicated. There was something about that smell. Something so ordinary and so undemanding that loosened something in my chest that I had not even realized had been held so tightly. I stayed at the inn for 2 days before I did anything at all. On the first day, I slept. Not the restless, medicated sleep of the medical center, but real sleep, deep and quiet and dreamless. I woke up only twice. Once to drink a glass of water from the bathroom tap, and once when a car passed on the road outside and the sound of its engine pulled me briefly to the surface before I drifted back under. The infection was still present in my body, in small ways, a dull ache behind my ribs, a heaviness in my limbs that came and went like a slow tide. But the doctors had said I was stable, and lying there in that quiet room with the white duvet pulled up to my chin, I believed them. On the second day, I woke early. The light outside was thin and cool, the kind of light that comes in February before the sun has fully committed to rising. I sat up in bed and stayed there for a while, looking at the trees outside the window. They were bare, every single one of them. No leaves, no green, just the dark, honest shape of branches reaching in all directions, like hands that had stopped reaching for anything in particular and were simply open. Then I reached for my phone. I had not turned it on since leaving the medical center. I had made a deliberate choice about that. Not out of fear, not out of drama, out of calculation. I needed to know exactly what Richard would do in the absence of contact. I needed to see his moves before I responded to any of them, and I needed him to feel, even for just a short time, what it was like to reach for someone and find nothing there. When the screen lit up, the notifications came in a slow, steady stream. 17 missed calls, 9 text messages, 2 voicemails, all from Richard. I did not listen to the voicemails first. I read the text messages. The first one had been sent the evening I was discharged. It was short. It said, "The nurse told me you left. Where are you?" The second one came an hour later. It said, "Laura, answer your phone." The third one, sent sometime around midnight, was longer. He wrote that he had called the medical center and been told I had signed myself out, that no one knew where I had gone, that he was concerned. He used that word carefully. Concerned, not worried, not scared, concerned. The way a business partner uses the word when a deal is slipping. The messages that followed over the next day and a half shifted in tone. Slowly at first, then more noticeably. The fourth message asked where I was keeping the documents. The fifth asked about the account Margaret had set up in Raleigh. The sixth one said, "I know you have been talking to a lawyer." I read that one twice. Then I set the phone down on the nightstand and looked at it for a long time without touching it. The amber light from the lamp beside me made the screen look almost warm, but the words on it were cold, clinical, precise. He knew about Margaret. I sat with that information the way I sat with everything, quietly, without reacting. I let it settle into the space around me, and I turned it over in my mind from every angle, the way I would turn over a column of numbers that did not add up, because something about it was wrong. Not the fact that he knew, that, in itself, was not impossible. Richard had connections in the legal world. He had friends in places that made it easy to learn things about other people without them knowing they were being watched. What was wrong was the specificity of it. He did not just know I had contacted a lawyer. He knew her name. He knew where she was based. He knew about the account, which meant he had known for longer than I thought. I picked up the phone again. I opened the remaining messages. The seventh one read, "We can handle this quietly." The eighth said, "You do not want this to become complicated." The ninth, the last one, sent that morning. The same morning. I was sitting in this small room looking at bare winter trees. Said simply, "Call me." I did not call him. Instead, I called Margaret. It took her 2 rings to answer. Her voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice that does not change its tone based on the weight of what it is hearing. I told her what Richard had written. I read her the messages, one by one, exactly as they appeared on my screen. Margaret did not interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me a single question. She asked me, "Did you tell anyone about our arrangement? Anyone at all?" I said no. I had not told a single person. Not a friend. Not a family member. Not anyone. She was quiet again. Longer this time. Then she said something that made me sit up straighter on the edge of that bed. She said, "Laura, there is only one way Richard could know what he knows, and it is not through his connections. Someone inside our process gave him information. Someone with access to the filings." I understood what she was saying. Not that Margaret herself had been compromised. She was too careful for that, too experienced. What she was saying was that somewhere in the chain, somewhere between the notary and the courthouse and the records office, someone had seen what we were building and had passed that information to Richard, quietly, discreetly, in the same way Richard himself moved through the world. Someone was watching us. I held the phone against my ear and looked out the window at the bare trees. A thin wind moved through the branches. None of them bent. They were too stiff, too dry, too stripped of everything soft to yield to anything. Margaret spoke again. She told me not to panic. She told me that what Richard knew was not the same as what Richard could do with what he knew. She told me that the documents were already filed, already sealed, already in the hands of the court, that even if he had learned about them, the legal ground beneath my feet had not shifted. Not yet. Not yet. Those 2 words sat in my chest like stones. She told me to stay where I was, to stay quiet, to not respond to Richard in any way. She told me she would run a quiet check on the records office, on the notary, on every single person who had touched our paperwork. She told me she would find out who had talked. I thanked her. I hung up. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and pressed my palms flat against the surface of the bed on either side of me. The duvet was soft beneath my hands. The room was still. Outside, the sky had turned a slightly lighter shade of gray, the way it does in late afternoon, when the sun is somewhere behind the clouds, but refuses to show itself. I thought about Richard, about the way he had stood at my bedside with that clipboard, about the way he had said the word concerned, about the way he had spoken at dinner years ago, making sure everyone in the room understood exactly where the line was drawn between his responsibilities and mine. I thought about all the years I had spent being invisible, all the mornings at the kitchen table with my coffee and my notebook, all the numbers I had tracked, all the accounts I had watched, all the small and large movements of money that I had recorded and filed and kept in order. I had been doing it this entire time, watching, counting, noticing every single thing that did not add up. And he had been doing it too, just in a different direction. We had been watching each other this whole time. Neither of us had ever said a word about it. 9 years of silence between 2 people who shared a kitchen table, 2 people who slept under the same roof, 2 people who had once, in another version of their lives, looked at each other and seen something worth staying for. That realization sat in me like a slow, cold current. Not surprising, not shocking, just clear, painfully, finally clear. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The plaster was white and smooth and unmarked, a clean surface, a place where nothing had happened yet. And then my phone buzzed. Not a call, not a text from Richard, a notification from the banking app on my screen. A single alert, small and quiet, the kind that most people would glance at and dismiss. But I am not most people. I picked up the phone. I opened the notification, and what I saw on that screen made me sit up, so fast that the dull ache behind my ribs flared, sharp and sudden, like a warning. Richard had not just been moving money, he had been moving everything. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid. Fear is a loud emotion. It fills a room. It demands attention. What I felt sitting on that bed in the small inn in Gastonia, with my phone in my hand, and the banking notification still glowing on the screen, was something much quieter than fear. It was focus, the sharp, cool kind of focus that comes when a problem finally reveals its full shape and you can see, clearly, exactly what needs to be done. I opened the notification again. Then I opened the app itself. I navigated to the account history, and I began to read. It took me the better part of 2 hours. The lamp on the nightstand cast its amber light across the bed, across my hands, across the screen, where the numbers scrolled in neat, precise rows. Outside, the February night was completely still. No cars on the road, no wind in the trees, just the kind of silence that settles over small towns after 10 o'clock, when there is nowhere left to be and nothing left to do except wait for morning. What I found was not just money. Richard had been reclassifying assets. Property titles had been quietly adjusted, not transferred outright, but shifted in ways that were technically legal and practically invisible, unless someone was looking for them with the specific kind of attention I had spent 9 years developing. Insurance beneficiaries had been changed. A second property I had not known about, a small unit on the east side of Charlotte, had appeared in records under his name alone, purchased 6 months ago with funds drawn from an account I had never seen before. He had been building something, not impulsively, not recklessly, carefully, methodically, in the same quiet, steady way that I had spent years building the household around him. We had been doing the same thing, at the same time, in the same silence. I set the phone down. I pressed my back against the headboard and looked at the ceiling of that small room. The plaster was white and unmarked and gave nothing away. I could have been angry, could have let the weight of what I had just read settle into my chest as something bitter, something that demanded a response, demanded noise, but I did not. because somewhere beneath the shock of it, beneath the cold clarity of the numbers, there was a feeling I recognized. It was the same feeling I had felt in that medical center when Richard placed the clipboard on my table and clicked the pen. Understanding. Not forgiveness. Not even close. But understanding. A clear, unflinching view of who this person was, who he had always been. And, more importantly, a clear view of who I was now in relation to him. I was no longer the woman on the bed. I was no longer the one being asked to sign. I was the one holding the pen. The next morning, I called Margaret. It was early, just after 7. The light outside was thin and pale, barely committed to being daylight. I sat on the edge of the bed with my bare feet on the cold floor and waited for her to answer. She picked up on the second ring, the same way she always did. Her voice was calm, measured, as if she had been awake for a while already and had been waiting for this call. I told her everything I had found, every reclassified title, every adjusted beneficiary, the second property, the hidden account, all of it. I read her the numbers from the screen the same way I had read her Richard messages the day before. Precisely, without emotion, without commentary. Margaret listened. When I finished, she did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "I found the leak." I waited. She told me it was a notary, a man named Gerald Pratt, based in a small office near downtown Charlotte. He had been the one to process 2 of our original filings. He was not someone Margaret had chosen. He had been assigned by the records office as an available clerk on the day our paperwork was submitted. An ordinary detail, the kind of thing that no one thinks twice about. But Gerald Pratt, Margaret told me, had a relationship with one of Richard's legal associates. Not a close one, not a formal one, but close enough that information could move between them quietly, without anyone noticing. Gerald had seen our filings. He had seen the power of attorney. He had seen the structure of what we were building, and he had passed that information to Richard. I listened to all of this without interrupting. When Margaret finished, I asked her one question. I asked, what exactly did Gerald see? Margaret was quiet for a beat. Then she said something that changed the shape of everything. She said, he saw copies. Laura, preliminary copies. The ones that were in the system for review before final processing. The originals, the signed originals, the notarized versions, the ones that actually carry legal weight. Those were never in his hands. Those went directly to the court, sealed, registered, untouched. I let that sink in. The room was very quiet. The lamp hummed faintly in the way that lamps do when they have been on for a long time. So Richard knew we had filed, I said. He knew the general shape of it. Yes, Margaret said. But he does not know the details, I said. The real details, the ones that matter. Margaret paused. Then she said, no, he does not. He thinks he does. But he is working from an incomplete picture. And that is a very dangerous thing for a man like Richard to do. Dangerous for him? I said. Margaret did not laugh, but I heard something in her voice that sounded like the closest thing to it. Exactly, she said. We spoke for another 20 minutes after that. Margaret walked me through what needed to happen next. An emergency motion to freeze all shared assets. A filing that would go directly to the court, not through any notary or clerk that Richard could reach. Margaret had already drafted it. She had already identified the judge who would handle it. She had already spoken, quietly, to the clerk who would process it. All she needed was my confirmation. I gave it to her. I gave it to her the same way I had signed every document in our marriage. Calmly, deliberately, with full awareness of exactly what each word meant. Margaret told me the motion would be filed that afternoon. She told me that once it was in place, no asset in our shared name could be moved, sold, transferred, or altered by either party without court approval. The freeze would be immediate, complete. Richard would not be able to touch a single thing. I thanked her. I hung up. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and sat very still for a long time. It was mid-morning now. The light had strengthened. The trees outside the window were no longer just dark shapes against a gray sky. I could see the texture of the bark, the way the branches split and divided, the small, tight buds at their tips that would not open for another month. Or more, but were there, waiting. My phone buzzed. A text from Richard. I picked it up and read it. The message was different from the ones before. There was no impatience in it, no demand, no urgency. It was calm, almost pleasant. almost reasonable. He wrote that he had been thinking about things, that he understood I needed space, that he had spoken to the bank that morning, and that they had confirmed everything was in good standing. He wrote that if I came home, they could sit down together and handle this the right way, quietly, without lawyers, without complications. He wrote, "I think we can work this out. Laura, just come home." I read that message 3 times, not because I was considering it, not because any part of me wanted to walk back into that house and sit across a table from Richard Mitchell and pretend that the last 9 years had been anything other than what they had been. I read it 3 times because I wanted to understand the tone of it, the confidence behind it, the ease. He sounded like a man who believed he had already won, a man who was offering terms not because he was desperate, but because he was generous, because he thought he could afford to be. He thought I was scared. He thought the silence was weakness. The disappearance was panic. The days without contact were the actions of a woman who did not know what to do and was hoping the problem would somehow resolve itself. He had no idea, not one single idea, that while he was sending those messages, while he was calling the bank and feeling secure and confident and in control, I had been sitting in a quiet room in Gastonia doing exactly what I had done for 9 years, quietly, methodically, precisely, watching the numbers, reading every detail, and making sure that every single piece of the structure was exactly where it needed to be. I set the phone down again. I did not reply. The afternoon passed slowly. I sat by the window and watched the light change. It moved across the floor of the room in a slow, golden arc, the way it does in winter when the sun is low and the days are short. I thought about the house in Charlotte, about the kitchen table where I had sat every Tuesday morning, about the garden in the backyard that I had planted with my own hands, about the scratch on the edge of the table that had been there since the day we moved in. I thought about who I had been when I first sat at that table, 28 years old, believing every word a charming man had said to me, believing that the life I was building was being built by 2 people, and I thought about who I was now, 37, sitting in a small room in a town no one paid attention to, recovering from an infection that had nearly taken me out of the world entirely, alone in every practical sense, and yet, for the first time in 9 years, not alone at all, because I had Margaret, I had the documents, I had the court, I had the law, and I had something Richard had never once given me credit for having. I had the full picture. He only had half. At 4 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed one more time. Not Richard this time. Margaret. The motion had been filed. The freeze was in place. Every shared account, every shared property, every asset registered under both our names, locked, sealed, untouchable. I read the message. I set the phone down. I looked out the window at the trees. The light was fading now, turning the sky that particular shade of pale blue that comes just before dusk. In February, I did not feel triumphant. That is not the right word for what I felt. Triumph is loud. It announces itself. What I felt was quieter than that. It was something closer to stillness, the stillness that comes when you have done everything that needed to be done, and there is nothing left to do but let it unfold. I sat there for a while longer. Then I stood up. I moved slowly, the way my body still required me to move, and I walked to the small closet where I had hung my coat. I took it off the hanger. I folded the single change of clothes I had brought with me. I placed them carefully into the small bag I had carried in from the car. Then I went to the front desk and paid my bill. The woman behind the counter smiled at me and asked if I had enjoyed my stay. I told her it had been exactly what I needed. She nodded, as if that were a perfectly ordinary thing to say, and handed me a receipt. I walked out into the evening air. It was cold, the kind of cold that settles into the skin after the sun goes down in February. I stood in the gravel parking lot for a moment, looking at the bare trees at the edge of the property. They were dark now, almost black against the pale sky. Tomorrow, Richard would wake up and check his accounts. Tomorrow, he would try to move something and find that nothing would move. Tomorrow, the ground beneath his feet would shift in a way he had not seen coming. And when that happened, I would be ready. I got into the car. I started the engine. The headlights cut 2 clean lines into the darkening sky. I was going back to Charlotte. Let's take a short pause in the story to remind you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. We post new stories every day. Thank you. Let's continue. I arrived back in Charlotte just before 8 in the morning. The drive from Gastonia had taken less than 40 minutes. I drove slowly. My body was still healing, and gripping the steering wheel made my hands ache in a way that reminded me, every few minutes, of where I had been only days before. I did not drive toward the house. Margaret had arranged a small office space in Midtown Charlotte, a temporary room, clean, quiet, neutral ground, the kind of place where no one would think twice about a woman sitting alone with a folder of documents. The building was on a side street, 2 blocks from downtown, plain, brick and glass, the kind of place that housed small consulting firms and the quiet machinery of everyday professional life. I parked behind it and sat in the car for a moment. The morning was still. Margaret was already inside when I walked in. She was sitting at a small conference table, no larger than the kitchen table in my Charlotte home, with a cup of coffee in front of her and a neat stack of papers arranged in 2 piles. One pile was thin, the other was thick. She looked up when I entered. She did not smile, but something in her expression softened, something that said she understood what it had cost me to get to this point. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down," she said. "Take your time." I sat. I did not take my coat off. I was not ready to be that comfortable yet. Not here. Not until I understood exactly where things stood. Margaret pushed the thick pile of papers toward me. "Everything is in place," she said. "The freeze went into effect yesterday at 3:17 in the afternoon. Court confirmed it at 4:42. Every account, every property, every asset under both your names, locked." I looked at the papers. They were formal, precise, court letterhead, stamps, reference numbers. The language was dense and technical, but I understood every word of it. I had spent 9 years learning exactly this kind of language. "Does Richard know?" I asked. "Not yet," Margaret said. "The formal notice was sent to his address this morning. It may already be in his hands. It may not, but by the end of today, he will know." I nodded. I set the papers down. I picked up the coffee Margaret had left for me and took a slow sip. It was warm, strong, the kind of coffee that wakes something up in the chest. And then my phone rang. Not a text, not a notification, a call. The screen lit up with Richard's name, and the sound of the ringtone filled the small room with a sharp, sudden energy that neither of us had been prepared for. Margaret looked at me. She did not tell me what to do. She simply waited. I looked at the screen for 3 rings. Then I picked up the phone and answered. The voice on the other end was not the voice I had heard at my bedside in the medical center. It was not the calm, impatient tone of a man who had already decided what needed to happen. It was not the easy, reasonable voice of the text message that said, "Come home, and we can work this out." It was a different voice entirely. "Laura," Richard said, and even in that single word, I could hear it. The shift, the crack in the surface of the man I had lived with for 9 years. Something had broken through, something he had not been able to hold back. He spoke quickly. The words came in a rush. He had called the bank that morning. They had told him the accounts were frozen. He had tried to access the investment fund and the system had rejected him. A formal letter from the court had arrived at the house. He had read it twice and could not understand how it was possible. "Laura, what have you done?" he said. I did not answer that question. I simply listened. I let him lay out everything he had discovered that morning, every wall he had walked into, every door he had tried to open and found sealed shut. I listened to the confusion in his voice, to the disbelief, to the slow realization that the ground he had been standing on was not solid at all. When he finished, there was a silence on the line, a long one, the kind of silence that sits between 2 people when one of them has just said everything they have and the other has not said a word. I said, "Richard, I would like to meet with you. Today, in person. There are things I need to explain to you, and I would prefer to do it face to face." He agreed. He did not hesitate. He did not argue. He simply said yes. I hung up. I set the phone down on the table. Margaret was watching me with that same calm, steady expression she always wore. She said nothing. She did not need to. We spent the next hour preparing. Margaret walked me through every document, every filing, every court order, every record of every transfer Richard had made, and every step I had taken to counter them. She made sure I understood not just what had happened, but exactly how it would look when it was laid out in front of another person. Richard arrived at 2 p.m. Margaret had chosen a small, neutral office in a shared workspace downtown, a room with a glass table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out onto the street. Nothing dramatic, nothing intimidating, just a room. I was already seated when he walked in. Margaret sat beside me, a glass of water in front of each chair. Richard walked in the way he always walked into rooms, but something was different. The confidence was still there, in the way he held his shoulders, but underneath it, there was something I had never seen in him before: uncertainty. He sat down across from me. He looked at the papers on the table. Then he looked at me. He looked like a man, trying to read a book in a language he had always assumed he understood. "Laura," he said. His voice was quieter now, steadier. He was trying to regain his footing, trying to find the tone that had always worked for him, but it did not land the way it used to. I let him sit in the silence for a moment. Then I spoke. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I spoke the way I had spoken every Tuesday morning at the kitchen table, going through the numbers, clearly, precisely, without a single word more than what was necessary. I told him about the transfers, every one of them, the dates, the amounts. I told him I had traced every single one, months before I ever set foot in that medical center. I told him about the second property on the east side of Charlotte, the address, the purchase price, the name of the agent he had used. I told him about the insurance, beneficiaries he had changed, about the investment accounts he had restructured, about every quiet move he had made to separate his financial life from mine. I laid it all out on the glass table between us, one fact at a time, the way you would lay out cards in a game that has already been decided. Richard did not interrupt. He did not argue. He did not deny any of it. He sat very still, and I watched something move across his face, the slow realization that the person sitting across from him was not the woman he thought he knew. When I finished, the room was quiet. "How long?" he said. "How long have you known?" I told him the truth. I told him I had found the first transfer on a Wednesday morning in September, that I had spent 2 hours tracing it before I fully understood what it meant, that I had called Margaret Chen that same evening. His jaw tightened. I watched it move, a small, involuntary shift, the kind of thing a person does when the ground drops out from under them and they are trying not to show it. "Gerald," he said. It was not a question. "Gerald saw copies," I said. "Preliminary drafts. He told you we had filed something. He told you the shape of it, but he did not tell you what was in it. Not really, because what was in it was not what you think it was." I paused. I let that sit. Then I told him about the power of attorney, the full one, the one that had gone directly to the court, sealed and notarized, before Gerald ever saw a single page, the one that gave me legal authority over every asset, every account, every piece of property in our shared name, the one Richard had never known existed. I watched his face as I said it. I watched the moment it landed. It was not a loud moment. There was no shout, no outburst, no dramatic collapse. It was quieter than that. It was the moment when a man who has spent years believing he is the one in control looks across a table and sees, clearly and without any room for doubt, that he never was. Richard was quiet for a very long time after that. Then he asked one more question. "What happens now?" he said. Margaret answered that one. She explained the terms of the freeze, what the court filings meant, what Richard could and could not do from this point forward. She explained it clearly and without judgment. It was not her place to judge. It was her place to make sure he understood exactly where he stood. Richard nodded, once or twice, the way people nod when they are not really hearing the words. Then he stood up. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. He walked toward the door. He stopped for a moment, his hand on the handle, and turned his head slightly, not quite looking back at me, but in my direction. I thought I might see anger in his face, or humiliation, or shame, but what I saw was something else entirely. It was recognition, the quiet, uncomfortable recognition of a man who has just looked at someone he thought he understood completely and realized he had been reading the wrong page the entire time. He left without a word. The door closed. Behind him, the room was still. Margaret and I sat in the silence for a moment. Then Margaret reached across the table and touched my hand. Just briefly. Just enough. "You did well, Laura," she said. I nodded. I did not trust my voice in that moment. Not because I was sad, not because I was angry, but because something had shifted inside me that I had not expected. Something that had nothing to do with the documents or the court, orders, or the frozen accounts. Something that had to do with the simple, profound act of finally being seen. For 9 years, I had been invisible. I had been the quiet one, the one in the background, the one who kept everything running while the person beside her took all the space in every room. And today, for the first time, I had taken up space of my own. I stayed in that room for a while after Margaret left. I sat alone at the glass table and looked out the window at Charlotte. The afternoon light was bright, clear, the kind of light that makes everything look sharper than it usually does, as if someone had cleaned the air and polished the sky. I thought about the house, about the kitchen table, about the garden I had planted with my own hands, season after season, never once being thanked, about all the Tuesday mornings, all the numbers, all the quiet work that no one had ever noticed. The justice that hurts the most is not the kind that shouts. It is the kind that moves quietly, the kind that builds itself in the background, while the other person is looking somewhere else entirely. It is the kind that is already in place by the time anyone realizes it is there. Richard had spent 9 years counting on my silence. In the end, my silence was exactly what finished him. I stood up. I gathered the papers from the table and placed them in a folder. I put on my coat. I picked up my bag. Then I walked out of the building and into the Charlotte afternoon. The air was cold, clean. The sky was a pale, endless blue, the kind that stretches in every direction without a single cloud to break it. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in, slowly, deeply, the way you breathe when you have forgotten, for a long time, what it feels like to take up space. I did not need to go back to that house. I did not need to sign anything. I did not need to prove anything to anyone. I simply needed to keep walking, and so I did, one step at a time, forward, into the light.